for young physicians starting out, it's tempting to think that leadership may start when you get a particular title, but in reality, it starts the first time that you're trusted with something that's not yours. With somebody, maybe their health. So as physicians from a very, very early adolescence, you're a leader the moment somebody follows your judgment. And if people are affected by their decisions, they're leaders. And what I would say specifically to the younger folks, decide your values before you need them. And I mean that in a very deliberate fashion, like actually write it down. Like we all hear, your pressure doesn't create clarity. Of course, no, pressure creates chaos. And so write down, what are your non-negotiables early. If you wait for a crisis to decide who you are, it will decide who you are. And then remember that restraint is a leadership skill. Delay, silence, humility, they're sometimes the hardest choices. But good leadership's not about always having great options. It's about knowing which ones that you're never going to take. Leadership in medicine is not about standing out. It's about being trustworthy when it would be easier not to be.
Hello, and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I am your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the hottest and most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. Today's show is brought to you by Belly AI, an AI-powered gut health app that helps you understand how food impacts feelings of bloating and discomfort. With features such as food analysis, personalized insights, and daily improvement tracking and planning, Belly AI makes it easy to track your patterns and to take control of your belly. As a lifelong patient managing Crohn's disease, I can honestly say this app is a game changer. Download it today on the App Store, Belly AI. Our guest today served as the 16th physician to the President of the United States and is the longest serving White House physician, Dr. Kevin O'Connor. While serving in the White House, Dr. O'Connor had the privilege of safeguarding the health and operational readiness of multiple U.S. presidents and their teams, a role that sharpened his expertise in crisis readiness, global health security, and executive decision-making, where every move carried profound consequences. Dr. O'Connor earned his bachelor's degree in biology from St. Bonaventure University under the ROTC Scholarship Program, and next earned his Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine from the New York Institute of Technology College of Osteopathy, finally completing a family medicine residency at Mountainside Hospital before beginning a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Army. His leadership experience was built on decades in military medicine, including service as the command surgeon of 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta and task force surgeon with the 75th Ranger Regiment, completing combat deployments during both Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Today, Dr. O'Connor is actively seeing patients at the George Washington University Hospital as the medical director of their International Patient Program and is the founder and CEO of Celtic Med, a firm that advises organizations and executives on risk mitigation, corporate resilience, and elite health strategies. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lee. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to speaking with you for quite some time since I met you, and I'm glad that we're making this happen.
Yeah, Kevin, we met quite a while ago and we enjoyed a great dinner together and we had some adult beverages and we shared, old man war stories. Of course, yours were literally about war
Yeah.
and my war was the war on COVID, but very excited to have you on the show. We have a lot of ground to cover. So let's start with some basic training for the listeners. You told me that when we first met, you chose to step into leadership because you believe some of the leaders before you were not leading so well. What was that moment like, or that realization that made you feel like stepping forward was not optional, but was necessary for you?
Yeah, Lee, I do have to admit that I was motivated to stay in, and pursue leadership within the military, past my obligation, more by the weaker leaders than the really inspirational ones. I realized that for every one of me who is just a simple guy that does love soldiers genuinely, who got out of the way, some other person that might be a schmuck may rise and fall into those positions of responsibility to care for these soldiers who may not be as altruistically motivated.
So, it makes me ask the next question as you think about leadership in general. Do you see it primarily as a position, a responsibility, or more of a moral act? So let's start with that position, responsibility, and moral act to be a leader.
It's I'd say it's definitely a moral act, because I could give anybody a position. Positions come and go. Your audience are young medical leaders, and I think I owe them. And so, the two things I would urge any young leaders to study and learn before they even start are number one, the classic fallacies. False dilemma, false equivalences, urgency to appeal, bandwagon, all that stuff. And then the classic ethical principles and leadership styles. Stick with me. The reason I'm asking to do that is because it's important to recognize those things when you encounter them as you go throughout your career, and then be able to combat the fallacies, and then utilize the different leadership strategies and styles to address the issues that come on. And the word of the day for why did I stay in, and why was I motivated like that, is deontology. Have you guys played with that one before?
No, no, expand on that.
Is based the deontology is duty based leadership. Comes from the Greek root of deo, deon, means duty or obligation, and its basic premise is that some actions are just inherently right or wrong, regardless of outcomes, because we're always focused on outcomes, and we should be. But its premise is that you do the right things simply because they're right. You're right. They're not just going to win the day or polls well or anything. It's when you hear somebody, oh, it's the right thing to do. Right thing to do is duty based, and the central premise to duty is stewardship. See, we all are taking care of all these things that are not ours. Right? Leaders hold something, in trust for others, and so stepping forward, certainly when you see someone else maybe not stepping forward, it's not so much a critique as it is a stewardship. You owe it to the entity, you owe it to the people that you're serving, you owe it to the army, whatever you're going to serve. It's a stewardship, and so this philosophy, compare that to outcome-based leadership or utilitarianism. What produces the greatest good for the greatest number, or character-based leadership, your virtue ethics. What would a good person do? All the time these days, you hear about servant leadership. Who am I here to serve? And then finally, situational or pragmatic leadership. What does this moment require? And you'll see that sometimes these different leadership or ethical approaches may give you different right answers. And so that's where, we get paid big bucks. We have to decide which is the appropriate application of an ethic. And so deontology, is approaching from a duty base. And so I stayed because it was an oath based or a duty based decision. And when you see authority leadership failing, the responsibility that, what they're tasked with, that doesn't disappear. The responsibility redistributes, and it may be redistributing to you. And so that's what deontology is. It's just a duty based leadership style, and it resonates well with medicine, with judicial processes, with certainly the military.
What you and I have talked about in the past, it frames your decision making as you move through your career. Where do you want to be in your career? And who do you serve? How do you do that ethically, with duty, service, stewardship, et cetera? And it helps makes the decisions a little bit easier. And I know from teaching chief medical officers, people want to accuse the CMO of having gone to the dark side and serving someone else's interest, whether it's a shareholder or a board. But I would submit to you that most of the folks that I know personally, that I've surrounded myself with, they are the one who always says in the room, well, is it right for the patient? Is it the right thing for our patients? Is it the right thing for our community that we serve? Which I think is what I'm hearing you say in my universe, as opposed to the experiences you've had. Does that add up?
100%. Lee. And that's at the chief medical officer level. For young physicians starting out, it's tempting to think that leadership may start when you get a particular title, but in reality, it starts the first time that you're trusted with with something that's not yours. With somebody, maybe their health, their story, their future. And so as physicians from a very, very early adolescence, you're a leader the moment somebody follows your judgment. And so, for instance, interns and residents, they're leading all the time. Usually invisibly. But if people are affected by their decisions, they're leaders. And what I would say specifically to the younger folks is, decide your values before you need them. And I mean that in a very deliberate fashion. Like actually write it down. Like we all hear, your pressure doesn't create clarity. Of course, no, pressure creates chaos. And so write down what are your non-negotiables early. Yeah, if you wait for a crisis to decide who you are, it will decide who you are. And then remember that restraint is a leadership skill. And not everything that's permissible is appropriate. Delay, silence, humility, they're sometimes the hardest choices. But good leadership's not about always having great options. It's about knowing which ones that you're never going to take. Leadership in medicine is not about standing out. All right. We're raised, especially the things you do to get into medical school, to get into residency. You're always trying to stand out, but you're there now. Okay. So leadership is not about standing out. It's about being trustworthy when it would be easier not to be.
That didactic is very much appreciated. And we'll swing and pivot a little bit to the next question. But you and I have also talked in the past about values based leadership. And you alluded to defining, writing it down, putting it in some sacred place, physically or in your soul, that you know what your true north is. And when we teach our CMO Academy, we ask the students to take a value inventory, and we give them 50, 60 different attributes or values, if you will. And it is the first time for 95% of them that they've stood back, stared at those words, thought about those words, wrote those words down, added other words, and it becomes a definite true north as I watch them grow in their career moves into physician leadership. So I know you have a values based leadership, and that ties very nice to the steward servant. Who do you serve? Moral act and obligation of leadership. So thank you for sharing all of that. But that leads to the next question, which is, you know your values, you hold them, you use them in service to the type of leadership you want to deliver. But then sometimes you may be at risk of losing something when holding tight to that. And I wonder if you want to share a little bit about what it's like when you have your professional values, and do you feel that you've ever compromised that or your oath? And you've used the phrase to me, Lee, what are you willing to lose in that scenario? So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
First, I'll go to the value of that value statement. And I'm so happy that your academy does that, as a very deliberate exercise. Because I think when people hear values, they're thinking, oh, these aspirational slogans and posters, but no, it's a tool. It's a decision filter. It actually helps you at the time. It's a filter. It helps to narrow the options. All right. So values don't expand your choices. They actually constrain them. But that turns it into a much easier multiple choice question. And so basically values, it shouldn't be things just that you admire. It should be tools that you use. And we talked about these pressure and I'll give you some stories about when I've experienced, but pressure reveals your values. It doesn't create them. Right. Like stress, we've all had these crises things, but stress is a spotlight. It's not a sculptor. You're not gonna, become who you want to be when you're getting cooked.
Right.
And so, if
You
you
literally get cooked. That's what
yes,
happens.
exactly. So I would say for the folks who have not done their homework and not actually articulated their values before the pressure, you don't have values. You have preferences. All right, and and if you don't have the values pre-decided, into basically an algorithm, then the expediency is going to fill the gap. And they may not be the best. And preferences, as will bend, whereas values the whole. Do you watch Billions?
I do not, sir.
Yeah, it was one of the first shows when I retired that I binge watched. I'd never had time to binge watch anything. But there's this character, Chuck Rhodes. He's a district attorney, very, I'm going to get the bad guys type guy. And he had this quote that was so good that I actually hit freeze and wrote it down. And he was talking about corruption. And he said, corruption doesn't happen all at once. It's a creeping erosion. And that just hit me so powerfully. It's a creeping erosion. Small decisions justified in the moment, until eventually you've compromised and eventually you're nowhere where you thought you were going to be. And so I would take that to the next level and say people don't become unethical under pressure. They become honest with what they prioritize.
Ah, honest with what they prioritize, which
Yeah,
may not be in service to something you don't own.
or what they would even want.
Right.
And so people are like, oh, builds character. Bullshit. Pressure and stress, it doesn't build character, it reveals character.
Yeah.
All right. And
Yeah.
it shows us and it shows everyone else who we already were. And so, when bad options exist, values are what help you come up with what you're going to do. And now you asked me the more emotionally vulnerable question of when you're willing to lose. And I'll give credit is due. The reason I say that to people is President Biden. I saw him countless times when he was with younger politicians, and they wanted his endorsement. And right before they're about to go out on stage, he'd stop and he'd say, "So tell me, uh, what are you willing to lose over?" And these young, excited people, they're excited. They got the president. They go out on stage like, wait, what? No, seriously. Like, give me the issue. What are you willing to lose over before you change your position on it? And if they couldn't give him an answer, he's like, no, I'm really not going to walk out there until you give me something you're willing to lose over. And so most people eventually snapped into it, but don't let it take a while. No upfront. No, this is a line I'm not going to cross. And I want to be careful discussing because it can sound dramatic. Because for me, doing the right thing is it's never about being heroic or moral grandstanding, and things big or small. But this is going to sound weird too, but counterintuitive. I would submit that choosing integrity in a way is actually a very selfish act. Because integrity is about identity preservation. Right? Not heroism. Integrity isn't about sacrifice. You always hear in that context that it's about self recognition. If you look at either an oath-based ethic or your own identity ethics, seeing an oath as a non-negotiable moral contract, it's not symbolic. There again, it makes the answer easier. Because we all make decisions, some of which we're really proud of, some of which we're not, and we have to live with the decisions we make. And the fact is, there's a chance for moral injury if you compromise that. And so it's not bravery; it's deciding who are you unwilling to become.
Right.
And so when you ask, well, what's it like? Just thinking of, recent and not recent examples I've had of having to, had thumb screws on to either do what I've already decided is right or not. I'll be honest. I'll be vulnerable. I mean, fear is real, and certainty is not a given. Everything's gonna be all right. You don't know that. Your certainty is actually pretty elusive, and the cost isn't abstract. It's very real. It's reputational. It's relational. You'll always remember who called, who didn't.
Right.
That pile's bigger.
Th-
Professional, what contracts you can get, where you're not going to get. Because that's the price. But value that you don't pay anything for isn't value, right? And so, whereas if you lose your integrity, if you cross that line that you swore you would never do, well, then you've forfeited the ability to ever lead ever again. And so violating doesn't just break a rule; it alters who you are. And so you can, if you do the wrong thing and you cross that line that you never want to cross it, you can keep your position. You know, you can lose your integrity and keep your position, but you lose the ability to lead. You know, and- and-
it's the erosion that you're talking about,
yeah,
and
yeah. I
you
mean, depending on what kind of profession you have, but we're in medicine. At some point, your oath, right? And there again, we have the osteopathic oath, the Hippocratic oath, and for the public servants, the oath to the Constitution. And at some point, the oath stops being something that you recite and it becomes something you are or
Right.
not,
Right. Right.
and so, and I don't say that to elevate moments I've had or and suggest that there's only one right answer, that these situations are complex and reasonable people can experience them differently, but I'm describing how I've come to understand my own experiences.
Yeah, and when we teach leadership, we share with our students, it's a very ambiguous space, and physicians are taught to be professionals and bring some certainty. Especially, not every medical decision has certainty, but they have to. As a professional, you have to create some certainty around that. But leadership involves living in the gray and the ambiguous, and you need a true north, and you need a value based inventory. And if you've declared an oath, as physicians have, then cutting corners and taking the shortcuts and beginning to marginalize the things that we're talking about will be that erosion, and you will no longer know what you're standing for and what you're abiding by. Oath notwithstanding. So I think this is extremely instructive, and I appreciate you sharing some of the personal things that you've gone through. You made a hint at something called moral injury, and not everybody even understands, what happens with moral injury. A lot of times it is out of your control, it's out of my control, and we're holding fast to what we believe is right, and somebody in a high stakes situation is violating that, and that is morally injurious to us. Um, but sometimes we have to be careful not to invite that injury to ourselves by being complicit or compliant with something that is wrong. And so we have to give up the organization, the title, the leadership, the money, and move on to remain morally intact and not invite that injury.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that's a lot to unpack for both of us. So let's talk a little bit about the fact that you're no stranger to the press, to the media, to cameras, and chief medical officers all over, not only the United States but the world, are learning to be in front of the camera and in front of the press, and they get a little HR coaching and legal coaching about what they can and cannot say. For example, how to address a case of measles or the first death of measles in the hospital in Lubbock, Texas, or shooting involving a law enforcement officer, like the West Virginia National Guardsman in DC, when the public is pressuring and seeking and demanding a level of disclosure, again, how might you anchor yourself, or how would you advise our listeners to anchor themselves to their values and withstand that noise and that pressure?
First off, there are professional communicators whose job that is. So you asked me about being in front of the camera. I'm kind of famous for I didn't play. I didn't do that. That's not what doctors do. There's other people who can do that. But the public does want to know, and we do have a responsibility to, whether it's yourself or through these people, to give honest information. And so, what I would always urge people to do is focus on the process. Okay, not the outcome. Focus on the process. That way, you've got a game plan, and then emphasize, privacy, accuracy, and proportionality. And so, when you get these pressures, whether it's a shooting or it's a measles outbreak or whatever the crisis might be, in the moments of the public pressure, it essentially separate the urgency, be it real or produced, from obligation. All right, the obligation is, not to satisfy the moment, not to give them their good, lives, but to protect both the individuals and the principles that we serve. Because transparency without discipline, in and of itself, could be unethical, especially in medicine. The media-driven urgency that it doesn't have to be followed off the cliff. All right, disclosure is not automatically virtuous. There's some things you can do it can really cause harm. And so ethical transparency requires timing, accuracy, and purpose. And so the key principles to keep in mind are they're again confidentially. Uh, Public reassurance is important, but it doesn't outrank the patient dignity of that family that lost a kid to measles, or the family has not been notified from an officer who's been shot. It doesn't outrank that. Patient dignity comes first, then public reassurance. Do no harm. Silence can be ethical. Speed's not always accuracy. And it's way more important to get the information correct than to get it out there, you know, quickly. Remember, we don't want to harm people. So my formula is three things. Okay, so say what you know. What I can say with confidence is say what you don't know. What we don't know yet is, and refuse to guess. Right? Blah blah blah. Speculating would be irresponsible. I appreciate that your viewers want to hear the answer to that question, but we'll get it when we have all the facts.
I'm going to borrow that transparency requires discipline. Sure, we need more of it, but not without ethics and not without discipline, or else you're going down the road that you're displaying. So that's great stuff. You wanted to add to that at all?
Well, no, I was just going to say, why focus on process instead of outcome is because the outcome will take care of itself, with time. But if you go by process pillars, what pillars do we have? Confidentiality is one, accuracy is definitely one, non-maleficence, and scope and scale. So confidentially, what am I allowed to say? All right. Can I say a name? Do I want to say? Does any good come from saying name? Accuracy. What do I know to be true?
Right.
Non-maleficence. Who can be harmed? And there again, we're doctors. We're not always thinking about all this. The legal people might be. Who could be harmed? There again, jurisprudence, lawsuits, all that stuff. Just hurt feelings. Traumatic news from a distant relative. There's all kinds of harm that can be done. And then scope and scale. What is proportional? What does the public actually need to know? For like future protection for them. Yeah, and all that has to be factored in.
These pillars and these structures around how to do this with ethics and moral courage can be very isolating, right? Very isolating. And leadership is lonely and everybody who's been in that role understands that. But for those who are still coming up into the role, I don't know if you have any additional comments on those costs, those seen or unseen, personal. When you choose the values over the convenience or the corrosion or the compliance with the pressure, any thoughts about that isolation of holding true to what's the most appropriate?
Yeah, and there again, it comes down to deciding in advance what you won't do, even if it might make your life easier in the short term, just to explain yourself. I mean, doctors are famous. We want to explain ourselves. We want to be understood, and that's a real vulnerability, on the leadership side. Because it'll cause you to do things because you want to be understood. It's not important that it's not about you. You being understood is not the purpose of your leadership responsibility. It's to be steward to the unit, to the purpose, the profession, all that stuff. And I've got one story from way back that was probably one of the hardest I ever had. I was in a unit where the respect of your peers was everything. And best job I ever had. And I had a soldier that ended up having real serious personal issues, inappropriately using controlled substances. And well, we'll help you, man. You're worth it. Um, nope, I don't know what you talk about. So say, hey, look, man, we found you asleep, in a chair when there's a needle, dude. You sure you don't want to ask me for help? Oh, no, no. See, I should have put that in the sharps container, but I gave a vaccine to somebody in the squad. I'm like, really? Because there was blood in the hub. Oh, yeah. Well, I aspirated to make sure I wasn't in the vessel. Dude, I'm begging it. Like, ask me for help. And he kept tripling down. He was like, no, I already talked about. And so I just had to hand off to the criminal investigations. You can't look the other way in that. Yeah, this unit had been around for a long time, a very elite unit, and the standards are not mine to give away. But then the guys, see what the outcome. Again, not the process, but the outcome, and they conclude that the sergeant major and I were kind of covering our butts at the soldiers' expense. You know, and it got bad. I mean, this unit was tight. That the sergeant major and I, we would go to the chow hall and put our sit down with our trays, and for about a month, every other person at that table would stand up and walk away. I mean, it was harsh. And to the point where the, squadron medics, the senior squadron medics came to me one day and they say, "Doc, you know, um, we've been thinking about it. We think you need to resign." I'm like, "Oh, and why is that?" Well, the Kevin O'Connor that I know would never have sold out, one of us, but it looks like that happened, and so that's what you need to do. I'm like, "Well, I will take that into consideration." Okay, I've considered it. No. But, more time went by and eventually they kind of pieced things together and all three of them came back to me and they say, "Hey, doc, we think we owe you a horrible apology. We think that maybe you were doing the opposite and doing what we would have expected that the Kevin O'Connor we knew from before." Yeah, I'm like, "Yeah, but you didn't think that, did you? You didn't think I could do that." Two things you can't take back: words out of your mouth and bullets out of your gun. All right, you can't take that back. And they said, "That's fair." And they turned around and started to walk away. And I called them back and we hugged it out and then we ended up being good. But man, that was horrible. It was a horrible couple months. And to this day, it bothers me how it ended. I just did everything I could do for it to be a better outcome for everybody. But stewardship, it's not your standard to give away.
Yeah. We started this question off with physicians and facing the pressure, and maybe they have not been trained in, or they don't have a public relations person to step up, or it is a requirement at that institution in the white coat. They're the one in front of the microphone. And then all the way through to this story where a very dear, close friend of yours has a problem.
I
And
mean,
the
it wasn't their
tact that,
business. I wasn't going to share that with them. I was
right.
protecting them, not me.
And the tactic that I would encourage, and I don't know if you've ever used this to our young listeners, is get your own ego out of the way.
It's not about you.
It isn't about you and the limelight and the headlines. It isn't about your friend who means so much to you or these buddies that you work with. You can put your ego over there for just a second and step back, go back to that values inventory, go back to the oaths and obligations of the stewardship of something that isn't yours. What's the right thing to do about that? And you got to move your ego to the side. It is easier said than done, and it comes at cost, just as your story shared. So,
Yeah, I mean, moral courage, it's not loud. It's often quiet and it's almost always lonely. I heard somebody say, the bill for integrity is paid up front, but the value compounds later.
yeah, yeah.
And so the respect that I got from the guys down the road because they saw, wow, like the sergeant major and I, we just took it. We just took it when we were absolutely persona non grata in a very harsh way, but because we're willing to take it to defend a principle, and a guy, the respect ended up being logarithmically increased later.
Well, thanks, Kevin. That is just a lot of material to process, and that's the beauty of this show. We can listen to it again and again until we process it. But so for our physician leaders listening today, especially those inside of a very large organization or a very high profile position, how might they think about the line between staying to influence change or leaving to preserve integrity? And what questions might they ask themselves when given that sort of more of a binary choice like that?
Should I stay or should I go?
All right, the quote of the day.
One of the hardest questions, because it rarely is about right versus wrong. It's usually competing goods and imperfect options. And so, so the first thing I would put aside is, staying versus leaving. Staying and leaving are not moral opposites. All right. Staying isn't always courageous and leaving isn't always principled. I mean, sometimes it's, I got to get off this sinking ship. The ethics are situational, not arbitrary. Either way you do it can be ethical or unethical, depending on the context and frankly, your personal motivation. But let me offer a decision framework. One, can I still speak truth, internally, even among the team? Why does this come first? Well, because leadership without a voice is not anything. It's performative. If you're going to have influence in anything, you have to have the ability to dissent. So make sure you still have that. And then, is this disagreement, is it welcomed or merely tolerated? Is it effectual? Will there be retaliation? And so the anchor to that, I would say, is staying in and of itself is not what loyalty is. It required, if the loyalty requires silence, it's not loyalty. And so number two, am I asked to do anything against my oath? All right. And so set the oath as the moral floor, not a goalpost. And so does it require me to bend the language or kind of justify things? Do I have to omit any, material facts? Do I have to prioritize, what comms wants which over something that might not be true? And so once you make the oath stuff negotiable, you've already compromised it. It's gone. So it's got to be absolute. And number three, does my presence, if I do stay, does it meaningfully reduce harm? Like, is it worth it? Did I blow myself up for nothing? The most subtle question is good intentions, they're not good enough. All right. It doesn't matter what you intended. What can you actually influence? And it's got to be real influence, not symbolic. Am I preventing worse outcomes? Or if I stay, am I lending credibility to a bad idea without good impact? And does my presence improve decisions that are made, or just help justify them? If you're just there to provide cover, then it's really worth asking who are you serving there?
Yeah,
You know,
that's the
that,
ego, impressing itself upon the situation. That
yeah,
is that's a great framework, and we could set music to, "Should I stay or should I go now?" It's great.
yeah. I
Alright, we're
mean,
gonna
it means you're not abandonment.
Yeah,
If you leave, you might be leaving with your reputation intact, so you preserve your ability to lead other places. By
yes.
keeping it enables your future influence, and moral authority to serve at, there's more than one institution out there.
Right, right. And I think just as a quick example, that's what we saw with the CDC. Many of the leaders who left because I think to your point, and I'm guessing they no longer had influence. It wasn't a credible place to work. Their credibility was in question, and they've gone out and find other places to serve and lead and make change. And change can come from a lot of directions. So it's probably ultimately we'll have to see where history takes us. But I think that's a good example. All right, 2 items to hit before we wrap up. At a time when trust in medicine, at least in my own opinion and maybe generically, it feels increasingly fragile and there's a lot of change and disruption. Any thoughts or words of advice to physician leaders to help them preserve that trust for themselves, for the profession, for their patients? Any thoughts about trust in the world we live in today?
Yeah, I mean, corny, but trust is built, in small, boring acts of consistency and predictability. It's built quietly. It is lost loudly. And so trust in medicine and specifics. It's not built in these moments of drama. Yeah, it's built quietly over time through small, boring acts of consistency, and that's why it's so easy to lose loudly and instantly. What do they say? Zero to hero over 30 years, and hero to zero over 30 seconds.
Right,
So consistency is, way more important than charisma. Medicine doesn't benefit from performative. We've all seen performative leaders. That's not helpful. Now,
right,
if you're a good
right.
leader who has performative abilities, yeah, then sure. But you know it in a second. Candor without cruelty, because delivering truth, you can do that carefully. Candor doesn't just mean bluntness. It means respect. All right. Honesty without empathy, abandonment. Like, oh yeah, you're gonna die. That's totally abandoned the patient's need. And so if you're compassionate when you're delivering the candor, that's not diluting the truth. It turns it into truth that might be more usable. Um, if you're delivering candor with, you know without cruelty, that preserves the dignity on both sides of that equation.
Yeah, yeah,
And so humility is a huge shared vulnerability that sustains your credibility. Trust deepens when the leaders admit that they have limits. Acknowledge uncertainty, correct mistakes openly, and avoid false certainty. Patients, they trust clinicians who know what they know and are honest about what they don't know. Boundaries, stay in your lane. Just stay in your lane, be good at what you do, and you'll be more valued that way. And always remember the fiduciary trust. The patient interest comes first. Optics, convenience, all that other pressure is secondary, and trust will survive. When your motivation is clear and well known.
Yeah, it's a nice bookend to your comments about corruption and the corrosive, slow, steady drip of it. The same is true of building trustworthiness. It's that slow, steady, boring upward, and corruption being the opposite. Both are done slowly with high levels of impact, depending on where you're going. All right, good stuff. All right, last thing. How does all of this fit into what you're pursuing right now, particularly with Celtic Med? Tell us about that, and how can folks connect and contact you relative to that work?
Yeah, sounds like Matt. I appreciate you asking. When I finished public service, military and government service, I came back here to GW. I'm here at GW leading executive medicine, and so for a portion of my time, I'll be seeing patients. But I didn't want to only do that. I do want to try taking these 30 years worth of just a very diverse and varied experience, and try to make that available to other entities, whether it's advisory work, with boards, board governance, with small businesses that are looking to scale, with established corporate entities that may benefit from leadership coaching, or just a guy coming in with fresh eyes, with my background. And so I'm offering that. Obviously, a vertical could be educational, developing curriculums, leadership medicine. I have a talk I give from time to time about the joy and privilege of medicine. Between service lines, education, and advisory services, even for PE and VC firms, where my efforts and due diligence may benefit them. That's what I'm offering up now. Yeah, but mostly I'm a doctor. And when I started it, Lee, I did exactly the way the military teaches in a way. It sounds like at your academy you teach in the chief medical officer's course. You start with, hey, what are my core values? And even though I've been doing this for 30, 35 years, I started all over again, because each new job, you should rewrite your leadership philosophy, rewrite your core values. And so I did. And core values are, like you said, there's 200 things I want to be. I want to be honest and, integrity and good hygiene. Like there's all these virtues you want to have. But if you're forced to limit it, what are you
Yeah.
finding core values? And so I limited myself to four. And so what I came up with, and there again, no right answer, everyone's is going to be different, but I came up with competence, courage, candor, and discretion. Got those four. And importantly, for my brand, for who I have been, who I want to continue to be, it was important to include all of those four, but also it's an important subtlety that they have to come in that order, because each one of them requires the one before it. So you start with competence. All right, that has to come first. If you're not good at what you do, if you're not a good doctor, none of the other stuff matters. Because there's administrators could be good leaders, all that. But no, if you're going to be a physician leader, start off, and I'd say young docs, focus in your residency, become a good doctor first. You can learn the leadership stuff later; it'll come later. Be a good doctor. So do that first, competence. And then courage. I mean, we're on casualty care is what I'm most proud of contributing to. That actually required physical courage too, and I don't think that would be questioned. And then the executive protective medicine that I did later in my career, was, that required candor. You got to speak truth to power. If you're talking to generals, presidents, ambassadors, whoever you're talking to, that does take some courage to do, but you also have to have candor. You have to effectively and efficiently give them the right words to tell them what they need to hear, not what they want to hear,
Right.
and do it in a time sensitive fashion, in a way that they can process and use for their critical decision making. And again, candor isn't bluntness; it's respect. For their time and for what else is going on in their mind. And then finally, after you've had those very direct conversations, discretion. You then keep that counsel to yourself, and protect them. And if you're in a corporate, sense, you don't, talk to the board about what the CEO said. You don't say to the CEO. The doc should be the safest space in any organizational culture. The chaplain and the doc, they should be the safest space. You know, and so that's what I came up with: competence, courage, candor, discretion, in that order.
That is very cool and much appreciated. Well, it has been fabulous to have you on the show, to have this conversation. I so appreciate your sharing a lot of life lessons, and sort of how you frame leadership, how you conduct yourself, and how we might apply that to our younger aspiring leaders. I mean, we have to pay it forward. It's existential for guys like you and I, because one day we're looking at somebody a little bit younger hovering over us a little bit. And I would hope I'd get that respect, that candor, that discretion, and everything you just mentioned. So great stuff. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. It's such an honor that that you'd even want to talk to me. Yeah, it truly means a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. Once again, today's show was brought to you by Belly AI. Download it today on the App Store, Belly AI. Want to learn more about resilient leadership and health systems? Contact Dr. O'Connor. Reach out to him about Celtic Med. You can find him on LinkedIn. You want to learn more about leading as a CMO, no matter where you go in your career, then check out our website, thefirechiefcmo.com, and connect with me on LinkedIn. Everyone knows I love talking with CMOs and physician leaders from all over the world. So get out there, maybe be an Army doc, be a Celtic doc, be a chief. And remember, whatever you do, in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.